the high country of central Colorado, where the Arkansas River carves a silver line beneath the jagged spine of the Sawatch Range, there is a stillness that visitors often mistake for peace. The town of Salida sits at nearly 7,000 feet, ringed by aspen groves and weathered granite, a place where mountain light falls in long golden columns through the pines and where, for most of the year, the loudest sound is wind moving through high grass. It was here, in the small unincorporated community of Maceville, just west of Salida, that Barry and Suzanne Morphew built the kind of life that from the outside looked almost cinematic in its ordinariness. Thus, a custom home they had designed themselves with their 2 teenage daughters, a business hauling produce across the western states, and a marriage that neighbors would later describe, with the particular caution people use when speaking about families after something terrible has happened, as seemingly happy. It happened that Mother's Day fell on May the 10th in 2020, and it was on that morning, according to the account Barry Morphew would give investigators, that his wife set out alone on a bicycle ride along the quiet roads near their property, and never returned. What followed would become one of the most closely watched, most procedurally troubled, and most technologically dependent criminal investigations in recent American history. A case in which the truth did not arrive in a single dramatic revelation, but was assembled slowly and unevenly out of cell tower pings, forensic soil analysis, buried digital metadata, and 3 years later, a set of skeletal remains recovered from a lonely stretch of land in a neighboring county. To understand how the case unfolded, it helps to understand the texture of the world the Morphews inhabited. A world that was at once intensely private and, because of the family's visibility in the small community, intensely observed. Suzanne Morphew was 49 years old that spring, a mother of 2, known around Chaffee County for her warmth and her physical fitness. She ran, she biked, she seemed, by every account gathered afterward, to be a woman building towards something rather than fleeing from it. Barry Morphew worked long hours in a trucking and produce business that took him across state lines for days at a stretch, and the rhythm of their household had come to depend on those absences and returns. On the surface, the marriage bore the shape of stability. Beneath that surface, investigators would later learn that a running current of tension had been building for some time, expressed not in the loud language of confrontation, but in the quieter, more modern vocabulary of unanswered texts, dating app activity, and a woman who, in private messages recovered long after her disappearance, indicated she was preparing to leave. The disappearance itself unfolded with unsettling ordinariness. Barry Morphew told authorities that he left the family home early that Sunday morning for a work trip, and that when he returned in the evening, his wife was gone. A bicycle and helmet later found abandoned along a roadside not far from the house, positioned in a way that struck investigators from the earliest hours of the case as inconsistent with an accident. There was no sign of a struggle in any conventional sense, no blood evidence at the scene that would immediately explain what had happened. Only the eerie, suspended quality of a life interrupted mid-motion. A bicycle on its side, a home undisturbed, a mother who had simply stopped being present in her own story. Search teams moved into the surrounding wilderness within hours. Cadaver dogs and volunteers combing the forested slopes above Maceville. A technical rescue helicopter sweeping the ridgelines. and for the community of Salida, the search became something close to a civic ritual, an outpouring of collective hope that, as the days accumulated into weeks and the weeks into months, gradually curdled into something more like dread. It was in this early period that investigators began constructing what would become the backbone of the entire case, a digital reconstruction of the days surrounding Suzanne's disappearance, built not from witness testimony, but from the residue of modern life, cell phone location data, text message timestamps, surveillance footage from gas stations and intersections along Barry Morphew's documented travel route, and eventually, financial and vehicle telemetry that placed his truck at specific points on specific roads with a precision no human memory could match. This was, in a very real sense, a case that would live or die on data long before it lived or died on physical evidence and the investigators assigned to it. A joint task force drawing from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and local Chaffee County authorities approached it accordingly, treating the digital trail left by both Morphews as a kind of second crime scene, one that existed not in physical space, but in the servers and towers that quietly record the movements of nearly everyone in contemporary America. What that digital reconstruction eventually suggested, according to the narrative prosecutors would later present, was a timeline sharply at odds with the one Barry Morphew had given. Cell tower and vehicle data, they argued, indicated his truck had made a series of unusual movements the night before Suzanne was reported missing. Movements that took him near dumpsters and remote pull-offs along his route towards Denver. Behavior investigators characterized as inconsistent with a routine overnight work trip. Text messages recovered from Suzanne's phone, some sent to Barry and some to others, painted a portrait of a marriage under considerable strain, including messages in which she described feeling emotionally isolated and expressed intentions that some investigators would later interpret as the early stages of a decision to leave. None of this, it must be said plainly, constituted direct evidence of violence. It constituted instead a mosaic of circumstantial signals, the kind of evidence that in isolation proves very little, but that, when accumulated and arranged along a timeline, begins to suggest a shape. Investigators also took note of something they couldn't ignore. In the days after Suzanne Morphew disappeared, Barry Morphew had visible scratches and abrasions across his arms and hands. He said they came from yard work and from rough encounters with the family's dog. But as the investigation progressed, forensic experts examined the injuries more closely. Based on their pattern and the way they had healed, they concluded the wounds were consistent with someone who had been involved in a physical struggle. For nearly a year, the case existed in a strange limbo, a missing persons investigation that had, in the minds of investigators, quietly transformed into a homicide investigation without a body, a legal and procedural gray zone in which prosecutors had to decide whether the circumstantial and digital evidence they had assembled was sufficient to bring charges against a man whose wife had never been found. In May of 2021, almost exactly 1 year after Suzanne vanished, that question was answered when Barry Morphew was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, tampering with a deceased body, and several related offenses. The arrest triggered a wave of national media attention, and Morphew, released on bond, gave a series of public interviews in which he maintained his innocence in emphatic terms, describing an investigation he believed had fixed its gaze on him early and never seriously widened its search, a phenomenon sometimes called tunnel vision in the language of criminal justice reform, in which investigators become so convinced of a particular suspect that alternative theories are underexplored. What happened next changed the course of the investigation in ways few had anticipated. At that point, the case was no longer defined solely by Suzanne Morphew's disappearance. It had also become a story about the immense weight of the justice system and the consequences of procedural failures. As the trial drew closer in the spring of 2022, Barry Morphew's defense team identified a series of discovery violations by prosecutors. They argued that key evidence, including materials from expert witnesses, had not been disclosed to the defense within the time required by law. After reviewing the record, Judge Ramsey Lama imposed significant sanctions on the prosecution, restricting the evidence and expert testimony that could be presented before a jury. The ruling dramatically weakened the case. Prosecutors had spent months assembling, altering the direction of one of Colorado's most closely watched criminal investigations. Faced with a trial, they could no longer realistically win under those constraints. Prosecutors made the extraordinary decision to dismiss the charges against Barry Morphew altogether, doing so without prejudice, a legal designation that left open, however faintly, the possibility that charges could be refiled if new evidence emerged. Morphew walked out of the courthouse a free man, and for the family of Suzanne Morphew, and for the investigators who had spent 2 years building the case, the dismissal landed less like an exoneration and more like an open wound, a mystery now stripped of its legal momentum, but not of its underlying questions. For the next 16 months, the case receded from national headlines, even as, out of public view, investigators continued the painstaking work of digital forensics, re-examining cell tower data, refining geographic profiling models, and applying newer analytical techniques to evidence that had already been collected years earlier. It is a pattern increasingly common in cold and stalled cases in the modern era. The recognition that a piece of digital evidence gathered in 2020 might yield entirely new insights when reanalyzed with 2023 software. And that the passage of time, so often an investigator's enemy, can in the realm of digital forensics sometimes become an ally, as extraction and analysis tools mature. Then, in September 2023, more than 3 years after Suzanne Morphew vanished from the quiet mountain roads near her home, the investigation took another heartbreaking turn. In a remote area of Saguache County, nearly 50 miles from the Morphew residence, human skeletal remains were discovered. Reports differ on exactly who made the find. Some say hikers, while others point to search personnel. But the significance was unmistakable. For the first time since Suzanne disappeared, investigators had recovered what they hoped would provide long-awaited answers. The remains were positively identified within days as those of Suzanne Morphew, and with that identification, the case shifted once again, this time from a homicide investigation without a body to a homicide investigation with forensic remains that, however degraded by years of exposure, could finally speak in the language physical evidence speaks, through toxicology, through skeletal trauma analysis, through soil composition, through the slow, patient science of determining not just that a death occurred, but how. The location of the remains itself became a subject of intense investigative interest. Saguache County lies across a mountain pass from Chaffee County, a remote and thinly populated landscape of high desert scrub and isolated ranchland. Not the kind of place a person passes through by accident, and certainly not the kind of place a lone cyclist would end up unless she had been transported there by someone else, whether living or, more grimly, already deceased. The distance and terrain involved raised immediate questions about logistics, about how a body could have been moved 50 miles across mountain roads without detection. Questions that led investigators back, once again, to the digital trail, to vehicle GPS data, cell tower pings, and traffic camera footage from the roads connecting the two counties in the days and weeks following Suzanne's disappearance. A second and far more granular pass through evidence that had, in some cases, sat largely unexamined for years.